Looks like it's streaming.
Oh, do you see it? It's still loading on my page.
Yeah, I have a notification that says this is now streaming live on Facebook. So I hope it is.
Okay.
Although on my, and possibly everyone can hear this, so hi everyone who can hear this, but when I look at it on my Facebook page, it's sort of still. So I don't know. Hopefully.
Well, good morning, everyone. Just in case, but let me make sure that everyone can see this. Here are the technological foibles I was so afraid of.
Elizabeth, if I look on my Facebook page, it's broadcasting. So I think.
Okay, here we are. Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We're here with Libby Copeland, an award-winning journalist who's written for the Washington Post, New York Magazine, New York Times, and The Atlantic, and specializes in the intersection of science, culture, and human behavior. We're here to talk about her award-winning book, The Lost Family: How DNA is Upending Who We Are. And just the first thing I want to ask is, Ms. Copeland, how did you come to write this fascinating book?
Well, thank you so much for having me, Elizabeth. And please call me Libby. So I came to write The Lost Family. I started looking to the topic about 3 years ago in 2017 when I wrote an article for the Washington Post. And the article was about DNA testing's unexpected ramifications in some people's lives. So I was very interested in the DNA testing for ancestry purposes, the four major companies, which are Ancestry, 23andMe, MyHeritage, and Family Tree DNA. It's an industry that's actually been around for 20 years, but really only in the last few years has the industry moved from being something that serious genealogists were into. It was more of a niche product for a very long time, to something where there's lots and lots of advertising, and there are a lot of casual consumers who are buying a DNA testing kit for, $59 during a sale, or gifting it to one another for Mother's Day or Christmas. And just because of the way that families are, there's sometimes, genetic secrets in our families, things we don't know about. And it just sort of statistically meant that many, many more people were having these experiences of entering into what they felt was a form of entertainment, a kind of a recreational diversion. I just want to see what my ethnicity pie chart says, how Italian am I, and finding these things that had really far-reaching consequences in terms of how they thought about themselves, in terms of how they thought about their own identities, their families, their relationships to truth and the past. And I thought it was a really interesting opportunity to look at in the form of this newspaper article. So I wrote this feature story for the Washington Post, and I got this unbelievable kind of tidal wave of response from people who had DNA tested themselves and wanted to tell me about how it had changed their lives. Changed their lives in 1,000 different ways, often in profoundly far-reaching ways in terms of how they thought about themselves. Sometimes kind of they were a bit bittersweet. Sometimes they were finding out sort of narratives that they'd long held true about their own families were not true. Sometimes these were they felt that DNA was a gift to them because it had illuminated something about themselves or about their own families. It's suddenly a lot of things that they never understood made a lot of sense. There were people who were discovering that they were donor conceived 60 years ago and had never been told, and now we're grappling with it. There was a woman who reached out to me because she discovered through DNA testing that she was adopted, and she had been adopted during an era when it was much more common for parents not to tell their children. There were a lot of people who were experiencing what's called an NPE, which is a non-paternity event or not parent expected, which is probably the most common kind of sort of DNA surprise that you can get, and a whole kind of gamut of reactions and gamut of reunions and rifts within families that came about as a result of these discoveries, and a lot of other kinds of kind of discoveries. And it got me thinking about how how we are asking ourselves now certain essential human questions as a result of the DNA age, which is kind of forcing a kind of reckoning. So questions about who am I? Who am I really? Am I the product of my experiences, or am I the product of my genes? How much do my genes get to inform who I am if I never knew about them till the age of 62? And I just found these stories so compelling, and I found the intimate lives of these people's lives being shaped by technology, their intimate lives. I found that so compelling. So I started doing reporting for the book. And the book, The Lost Family, How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are, is basically a number of narratives. There's a sort of a central narrative, which I can talk about in a minute, that kind of powers you through the book, which is a genetic mystery. But then there's many, many other stories in there. And a number of them are from people who did reach out to me after that Washington Post article, or people I found in my reporting. And I have a little section from the prologue, which I can read. And it sort of talks about who gets into DNA testing and why. So I will read that right just from the very beginning of the book. I came to think of the community of people I encountered researching this book as seekers. They are people obsessed with figuring out just what's in their genes. Not everyone who orders a direct-to-consumer DNA test qualifies as one, though a lot of folks who enter into this casually find themselves unexpectedly captivated by questions they never thought to ask, questions posed by the DNA itself. At-home DNA testing is sometimes called recreational to distinguish it from genetic tests that are ordered by doctors, but its implications can be far more profound than the term recreational implies. The seekers generally fall into one of three categories. Some started out as avid genealogists. Before they ever ordered a DNA kit, they were already subscribers to the vast stores of genealogical records at Ancestry.com. Some had already flown out to the Mormon-run Family History Library in Salt Lake City, Utah, and spent a week there, camped out up to their ears in old church records on microfilm. For these people, DNA testing through a company like Ancestry or 23andMe was a logical extension of this deep genealogical curiosity. These folks try to trace their family trees back hundreds of years, using DNA combined with genealogy to suss out the identity of a particular 19th century ancestor, or to figure out exactly how they're related to a distant cousin. If elderly relatives have difficulty generating enough saliva to spit into a vial, these seekers know the answer is a slice of lemon. A few, thwarted by the unexpected timing of events, have even resorted to swabbing the insides of their parents' cheeks after death. The second category of seekers is marked by a more immediate and pressing puzzle, brought on, say, by lingering suspicions that the man they call dad might not be their genetic father. Or they might be looking for evidence that they're not related to a family they never felt at home in. Some find their suspicions validated and others are disabused of them, and some find something else entirely, like a previously unknown half-sibling. Many seekers are adoptees looking for their biological relatives, or people conceived by sperm donors seeking the stranger who contributed half their genetic material. These seekers join Facebook groups dedicated to the mechanics of what's known as genetic genealogy, learning to talk of haplogroups and centimorgans and triangulation. They sketch countless family trees, trying to figure out where they might fit into them. They call their hobby an addiction. They read tips on how to phrase letters of introduction to their fathers. A topic so fraught and fascinating for what it reveals about the vagaries of human nature and the complications of the human heart that it deserves a dissertation or three. The third category of people have no inkling they're about to find anything surprising, and this is often the most disruptive way in which DNA testing plays out. These people do not start out as seekers. Instead, they test to find out if that old family story of a Native American ancestor is true. They test because they want to know whether they're like that guy in the Ancestry DNA commercial who thought he was one thing and turned out to be another. I traded in my lederhosen for a kilt, he declares, happy in his certainty. They test because they got a kit as a gift for Christmas, and then Easter dinner becomes awkward because the test has revealed something strange. Perhaps a family's understanding of its heritage is muddled by a pie chart offering one's ethnicity estimate, and the question, why is it saying I'm half Greek, becomes a curiosity, which becomes a nagging doubt, which becomes a family conversation that no one will ever forget. Then these people too become obsessives, trying to solve the mystery, finding possible relatives through Google and Facebook searches, and then offering to buy and ship DNA kits to those people if they'll agree to test. Well, some of them do. Some of them presumably back away slowly, like a hiker who spies an old grenade from a long ago war on a beach. These people don't tell their stories. Who could blame them? These people don't have stories. They have DNA results they'd rather not have seen and which they may prefer not to believe. So that's just a little taste from the start of the book.
Thank you so much for that. So I read it myself, and the central character, there are so many different stories in there, but the main one that it kind of centers around is the story of Alice Collins' Playbuke. Without spoiling the story, can you explain why her singular quest provides such a powerful window into home DNA testing?
Yeah, so she's so awesome. So Alice Collins Playbuke is a woman who tested in 2012, back when there weren't that many people in the DNA testing databases, and back when this was still something that was really for early adopters in many ways. She tested through Ancestry when their test had just been released. It was actually still in beta testing, so she wasn't even sure how good it was going to be. And she was somebody who had been doing her genealogy for some time. She knew she was almost entirely Irish American along both sides. She had Irish roots with like a smattering of British and Scottish thrown in. But she knew that her pie chart was going to be basically like all one color, and it was going to say British Isles. And she was so certain that when she got her results, she was stunned because instead of looking the way they expected, she expected them to be, it was a pie chart that was split down the middle. And one side suggested that her genetic ancestry was this mix of British Isles and Irish that she expected. And the other was Ashkenazi Jewish, which is Jews from Central and Eastern Europe. And it made no sense given everything she knew. And she actually went so far as to email Ancestry, like emailed their kind of customer support form and said, you guys don't know what you're doing because like clearly your science is not up to snuff. I know my family along both sides. So, what are you talking about? And it would eventually turn out that in fact, Ancestry was right. And that it was Alice and her siblings who had their family history very wrong. Now, what makes Alice's story interesting? There's a number of things. The typical explanation for why you get a pie chart that's half not what you expected is because you are not genetically related to your dad, right? That would sort of be the most common explanation. And it turns out that for Alice, that is not the explanation. And in fact, every sort of foreseeable explanation does not apply for her. So it turns out when she investigates and she tests her theory all sorts of ways that she is not the product of a non-paternity event, right? Her mom didn't have a relationship with somebody else. She's not adopted and nobody told her. That's not the case. She's not donor conceived. And she's not sort of the fourth bucket of possibility that she explores, which is, that her family somehow hid their genetic ancestry. Like she has this theory at one point that maybe they were Jews who came over and passed themselves off somehow as Irish, or maybe they were Irish Jews, forces of assimilation, emigrating to the United States, and it was all forgotten. So, no. And the reason that Alice's story is so interesting is because it has this very unusual kind of outcome, this very surprise ending, I could say. It's like a whodunit. It's an existential whodunit, right? It's like, how can this be? It takes her 2.5 years to figure it out. And in that time, what she essentially does, because she's somebody who has incredible facility with technology and experience with data and organization of data because of her career, she's recently retired. What she does is basically build a database of her own DNA and the DNA of all 6 of her siblings. She's from a large Irish Catholic family. So there's 7 siblings. She has them all test. She creates massive, insane level of detail spreadsheets so that she can figure out exactly how she's related to the thousands and thousands of genetic relatives who show up for her in the databases of the major testing companies. And of course, she's in multiple databases. It's a bear of a job. And it is her full-time job with her sister helping her for 2.5 years. So the reason I think Alice's story is so compelling is first of all, because Alice is funny and has an incredible analytical brain and just so smart. And we kind of get to follow her like through her journey to her kind of surprise ending, and sort of hear from her the wisdom about how this changes her outlook on her own family and on the world, and wrestle with questions about spirituality, about religion, like the questions that I was alluding to earlier, right? Like how much does your genetic ancestry get to inform who you are and why? But also because at every turn, as she explores a new theory behind her unexpected results, um, and dismisses it, like for instance, I'm not donor conceived, or I'm not an end product of an NPE, she can take that. I can take the opportunity of showing you what that looks like. And so I have a lot of kind of intimate tales in the book of people who, discover something and how it goes for them. Right? Do they want to reach out to their genetic dad? How do they do it? This is something people think about a great deal, and there are whole kinds of discussions about how to do it properly. How does the man on the other side respond? And it's something that's very much out of the control of the person who's seeking connection, and it can be very painful when people are rejected. It can't help but feel personal, even when it's technically not personal, right? So what Alice's story allows me to do is bring in the stories from, contemporary seekers, people all over the country. And frankly, this has happened to people all over the world, but this is primarily an American phenomenon because we are the people who are most in those databases. Looking at how this technology is shaping how they see themselves. And I really believe that this is something that's reshaping individuals, reshaping families, and then reshaping the culture at large, because we are in this enormous moment of reckoning with the past.
Yeah, that was one of the most interesting points for me, was the argument, like, you have the right to your genes, but do you have the right to decide for, like, your ancestors who didn't get to choose what you're about to find out about them? How do you reconcile, like, someone's quest for who they are with the right to privacy for their ancestors?
That's such a great question. Wow, I love that question. No one's asked me that before. Um, yeah, I mean, that was something that I was really interested in when I was writing about it, is this idea of the privacy of the dead. We've made certain decisions to give up our privacy, and we give it up in all sorts of ways. It's not just that we do DNA testing, and there are 35 million people in the databases at this point, which is like massive, and most of them are American. So close to 10% of the US population has tested. Like, wow, right? That's kind of amazing. But it's not just that. It's all the information we give up about ourselves, right? Online, on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, on white pages, and anywho, and all the people search kind of functions that allow you to find out something about somebody if you're looking for them. And in fact, the reason that DNA testing is so powerful, for me, if I'm looking for a genetic relative, trying to identify, say, if I was seeking my genetic father, if I didn't know his identity, and I couldn't find him in a database, but I could find a relative of his, I knew it was on my paternal side, and I'm trying to figure out his identity. The reason that DNA testing is so powerful is because you can combine it with the power of social media and all the other kind of digital breadcrumbs that we leave. So we do give up our privacy in all sorts of ways, and we make those choices on behalf of our children very often, and also on behalf of those who came before, right? And so in Alice's case, you're faced with a situation where I won't kind of say what happens, but like her discovery has implications for people who came before her, right? Because it's actually turns out to be a 100-year-old mystery. It's precisely a century old, basically, when she discovers it. And those people don't get to consent to having their identities retroactively changed after death, right? And it invites all these questions for not just her, but it turns out to have implications for another family about, like, what would those people have felt if they had known, and would we have wanted to tell them? And in fact, it's one of the central questions that I find people grappling with. And there are a lot of sort of support groups for people, especially on Facebook, but also elsewhere. There are kind of advocacy organizations that are springing up for people who've experienced DNA surprises. And one of the central questions they ask themselves is not just who am I, but who would I have been if I had known, right? If I'd known sooner, if I'd known at 6 rather than at 60, that, you know, the man who raised me isn't genetically related to me, or that I have a half sister out there that I would have wanted to have a relationship with if I could have. So then to ask those questions on behalf of all those who came before and are no longer there, it's really an interesting question. You know, when we engage in DNA testing, we are in some ways, and I say this as someone who has done DNA testing and multiple times in several databases. So I totally understand the lure, and I made a decision for myself that I was willing to do it. But I say that knowing that I am giving up the privacy of my ancestors in some ways, and also my descendants. And that is a kind of a decision that can't be reversed.
Maybe no right answer, just something one has to decide for themselves.
Yeah, and it's really, I mean, what you can find out is amazing. I don't know if you've done it yourself, but like what you can find out is so incredible, right? And there's the kind of it's like a wrapped present under the tree, and you don't know what's going to be inside. And there's this sense of excitement when you first do it. And the thing is, you just have absolutely no way of predicting what that could be, right? It could be like in our family that you find like a cousin that like allows you to research a branch of your family. And it's like this really cool sort of bullet train to the past, right? Or it could be that there's something in your immediate family that you weren't looking to find and is profoundly different than you expected. And it kind of constitutes a breach of trust then with your mom, say, who never told you something key, and you simply don't know what you're going to find.
Let's see, one of the things we were talking about how over 35 million Americans have taken an at-home DNA test so far, so it's kind of reaching a tipping point. What are the implications of that?
Yeah, so what that means, that kind of tipping point means that like the majority of the population at this point, well over the majority, has at least a third cousin in a database. And the reason a third cousin or closer, third, second, first cousin, aunt, uncle, sibling, parent, child, the reason that that is relevant is because that is the threshold to make somebody who's not in the database potentially identifiable using genetic genealogy techniques. So what does that mean? That means that my decision to test has implications for like many, many people. I don't know if it's certainly hundreds, who I may not even know all of their names, right? Like I don't know all my third cousins. I don't know any of my third cousins probably. And yet because of the decision I make, because we share genetic segments, if there's somebody in the system, you know, who's sharing DNA with someone not in the system, then they become potentially identifiable. So how does this work? I'll use this example, which I've used a few times, which is not actual, but theoretical. Let's say that I have an older brother. Let's say that my older brother unwittingly conceived a child in high school, right? He was 17 and he didn't even know that he'd gotten his girlfriend pregnant, and then his girlfriend didn't tell him. And let's say she raised that child and never told the child his identity. But one day, that child decides to do DNA testing and seek out the identity of her genetic father. And my brother never tested, but I did, or even someone more distant from us. But let's just take the example of me. I show up as a genetic aunt to that child, and that makes it extremely easy for the child to discover my brother's identity. It could be that the child reaches out to me, which is one way it could go. But it's also possible that through all these digital breadcrumbs I've left, that child can basically just like research that I have like one brother or maybe two, and figure that it's one of those two people, right? And then reach out directly to him. And so what that means is that if you are sort of the mind that you are declining to participate in this technology because you don't know what kind of, you know, things it might bring out about your family that maybe you're not willing to grapple with, the reality, for better or worse, is that you can't opt out anymore. So if there's a genetic family secret for you, it's literally not a question of if, but when. And that means that we are all kind of forced into this moment of reckoning, and we need to start having difficult conversations about truths that were never told.
Um, so that psychological transformation that you talk about, is it related mostly to the surprising revelations, like things that no one in the family, well, except for the secret holder, ever knew about?
Yeah, so psychological. So I would say that you know, I haven't experienced an immediate DNA surprise in my family. So I you know, I speak as somebody who's interviewed a lot of people but hasn't experienced this from the inside out. But what I found was that this is a really big deal, particularly to find out that your genetic origins aren't what you thought. And you know, particularly for people for whom this hasn't happened, there's sometimes a tendency to be like, what's the big deal, right? Like, you know who your dad is. Your dad's the man who raised you. What does it matter if someone else you don't know contributed half your genetic material? Or what does it mean? What does it matter that you all this time you thought you were half you know, fully Irish, and now you realize you're half Ashkenazi Jewish, or you're, you know, you didn't know that you had you know, some Italian ancestry or whatever. Like, what does that matter? It does matter. It matters. It matters a great deal. And it matters in all sorts of ways for people. So having interviewed a lot of people and having interviewed some psychologists who sort of specialize in this, I'm told it can be like a trauma. And that's definitely what I've found in interviewing people, that it was a traumatic experience to find out that your genetic origins weren't what you thought. That trauma can first sort of surface as denial. And if you talk to the major companies, like, you will find that, like, they are very much in the habit of getting phone calls from people who are saying, like, your science isn't up to snuff. It's saying some stranger is my genetic father, but that can't be. Or why is 23andMe telling me I have a half sister? I don't have a half sister. Like, you guys don't know what you're doing. Well, almost always it's not a mistake on the part of the companies. Almost always it's you know, something that somebody didn't know. So following denial can be sometimes anger at the secret keepers, like the person who didn't tell you. And then sometimes guilt for feeling angry, because obviously people are in situations that are very understandable. There are often very compelling reasons why people didn't tell. And it's difficult to judge sort of past practices by contemporary culture, right? The mores have changed. And then there's sometimes what one psychologist described to me as anxiety at a loss of identity. Because it's, you know, it's something people describe to me over and over, and they used like amazingly similar language. Like, totally different people would use the same language and the same evocative descriptions to talk about their own experiences. So it would be things like, I've been waking up in the middle of the night and remembering childhood experiences I haven't thought about in like decades, and reinterpreting them now, because now I'm remembering things that I had forgotten about that never made sense, and now they make sense, right? A conversation I had with my mother when I was 10, like, bing, it pops back into your mind. It prompts people to go back and re-edit their lives, to kind of think about, like, what would I have done if I had known, or what did this mean now I understand? And then there's often a sense of regret. You know, what if there's a psychologist who talked to me about her own NPE experience, and she described meeting cousins who had grown up not too far from her, genetic cousins, who she could have had relationships with as a young woman, and didn't, because she didn't know that that they existed, and that she had a biological father out there other than the man she understood to be her father, her biological father. And seeing them for the first time, she was filled with grief for all the last years, like the grief of not having known what you didn't have. And it's a process that goes on. Frankly, I don't know how long it goes on, right? Because autosomal DNA testing, the kind of DNA testing we're talking about, has really only been around for about a decade. Industry is older, but the early tests were different. And so the kind of testing we're talking about, the one that's going to tell you immediate relatives, is basically a decade old. And the people that I interviewed who had these revelations in 2012, 2013, 2014, they are still reeling and grappling with it. Not to say that they haven't had some kind of, closure around it, but it's something that continues to play out throughout their lives. It's not like it's over. Because if you think about it, we all have these kind of narratives we tell about ourselves, right? We all have stories, and it's when we introduce ourselves to people, we have that story in mind, but also just like when we're processing our own lives, right? And we don't have an end yet, thank goodness, but we usually have a beginning and a middle and a kind of a sense of a trajectory, and we edit that information to form a narrative because human beings are storytellers, right? Well, how can you tell your own story if you don't have a beginning, if you don't have a once upon a time? If all of a sudden your once upon a time is radically different and premised on maybe an omission or an untruth, right? It's kind of like disorienting, and it can have implications for then, your relationships with all the people in your family. Maybe some people knew and didn't tell you. And then there's this whole other family out there, perhaps, depending on the situation, that now you are trying to forge relationships with. So it has kind of ripple effects. I say that for, each single person spitting into a tube and discovering something surprising, that there may be, say, 8 or 10 people who are affected by it. Because if I discover I'm not genetically related to my dad, it has implications for my dad, for my mom and their relationship, for my siblings who are suddenly now I know half siblings. And then there's this whole other family out there that I'm now getting to know, my genetic father, his wife, their relationship, and now my newfound half genetic siblings through my biological dad. So 8 or 10 people affected by my revelation is just kind of a massive sea change to American culture.
For sure. So when you talk about the NPEs, the non-paternity events or not parent expected, that's maybe one of the more fascinating aspects of it, but how common would you say that is in your experience?
Yeah, that's a good question. It, according to the best population geneticist studies and kind of cross-cultural meta studies I could find, it's said to be at about 2%. And that, I would say, combined, there's one other experience that's very common, and that is finding a half sibling you didn't know about. And sometimes you find a half sibling you didn't know about because it turns out you're not genetically related to your dad. But sometimes you're finding a half sibling not because of an NPE situation, but because, like, say one of your parents had a child before you were born, right? Or had a child, maybe your parents were together and they were separated, or one of them, had a relationship outside the marriage and there was another child that way. So if you take those two experiences combined, it's conservatively in the low single digits. If it's, say, 3% of 35 million people, then you're talking over 1 million people. But of course, there's many other experiences. There's the experience of discovering that you are adopted. There's the experience of discovering that your donor conceived and you have 20 siblings, which I also write about. And in fact, there's no restrictions on the number of children that one sperm donor can conceive. There's no restrictions in the US. So there are cases that are now coming to light, and partly as a result of DNA testing, of these sprawling genetic networks of between 100 and 200 half siblings, all through the same donor father, right? Can you imagine having 100 half siblings, right? Which, then it's like just incredibly complicated, and it's something to manage for people to think about. It provokes questions about, how do you identify, is this family? What kinds of relationships do you want to have with people? What's the terminology? And I get into a lot of that. And then that number that, say, more than 1 million people doesn't account for situations in which people have had their genetic ancestries hidden from them. For instance, I write about a man in the book who has significant sub-Saharan African ancestry. He's 18% Black. His mom didn't tell him because she was trying to protect him from the racial discrimination she had experienced. So he was told he was Sicilian. And there are all other families, where they passed for white because they could, and that story is several generations back and it's been forgotten, or it's been agreed upon that they're not going to speak about it. And then it doesn't also account for, when I went to Ancestry headquarters. I did a bunch of travel for the book. So I went to Utah, I went to the Ancestry headquarters, I went to the Family History Library, I went down to Texas to the oldest company, Family Tree DNA. Anyway, there was a woman who was working at Ancestry who was steeped in genealogical research and in the complications of other people's lives, and very familiar with the surprises of DNA testing. And she told me, I didn't think it would happen to me, which is what everyone always says. But I discovered I had a genetic first cousin through an uncle. And, he gave that child up for adoption and no one ever told. And I discovered my family's very good at keeping secrets too, she said. So there's all these little buckets, right? So when you're talking about maybe more than 1 million people for NPEs and discovering genetic half siblings, the true number is much larger. And then if you look at the number of people affected by the revelation, as I said earlier, you're talking about millions of Americans. So it's really a sea change.
Yeah, speaking of the African-American incident that you mentioned, what did your research reveal about the implications of at-home DNA testing for African-American ancestry, considering the history of slavery in America?
Yeah, it's really interesting. 23andMe, which is the second largest recreational DNA testing company, has done a bunch of research looking at sort of what the genes of America can tell us about the history of America. And they've found, for instance, that something that many African Americans already know, which is that they will have significant European American genetic ancestry or ancestry in their genes. And a lot of that you can sort of see written out how that came to be. And it is very often the majority of cases for what they're looking at, they're looking at like pre-1860. It is the relationships between white men and Black women. So you're talking about basically, the rape of enslaved women. And you can see it written in the genes, and they can sort of see how those genetic contributions were made. So there's I think an unflinching history lessons to be seen in contemporary study of the genetics of the American population. At the same time, there's an incredible, on the level of individual research, there's opportunities to have access to information that previously would have just been impossible. So I interviewed some Black genealogists who talked about how DNA testing had allowed them access to the past, right? There's one man who talked about how doing research of his enslaved ancestors is so difficult because pre-1870, the federal census doesn't list enslaved people by name. It's just like tick marks in a box. So what he was able to, basically like, if you get past that point, like where are the records? There's no records to assist you. And in general, this is not just true for Black Americans. This is true for many populations. War, migration, burned churches, burned synagogues means, in Europe, for instance, means that you get to a certain point and then you're kind of hit a brick wall, what genealogists call a brick wall, right? And so DNA can really help with that. And so for this man, through DNA testing and through both the ethnicity estimates, but also finding a present day cousin who lived in Africa, he was able to find out not just the region where a particular branch had come from, not just the country, but the particular area within that country and the specific people, the ethnic group within that region, within that country, within that area of Africa, and their language and their customs. And this is like just an incredible gift for this man, right? Something that he would not have been able to achieve before DNA.
I think what you were talking about earlier about the donor conceived, one thing that struck me in your book, you were talking about there was a man and he found out he had 64 children conceived that way. And I hadn't even considered that they could use a specimen or a donation more than once. And then there was one doctor who was like using his without the person's consent, like just, and it was the weirdest thing. Like what would drive a person to want to do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So because of DNA testing, there's this growing awareness of something that's now been dubbed fertility fraud. So fertility fraud is like becoming a big deal, and you're starting to see on state by state level legislation that outlaws fertility fraud, but what's happened up to this point has been considered legal under the law. And that is that there was a practice within the fertility industry by doctors to use their own sperm. And this was primarily pre the 80s. So you're talking 70s, 60s, before they were using, as I understand it, before they were using frozen sperm. So if you're using fresh sperm, there's kind of a window of time when you need to use it. And you're trying to coordinate with the, I guess, also the ideal time for the woman to be inseminated. And for whatever reason, these were cases where instead of getting actual donors, the doctor was like, I'll just use my own, right? And it's unclear in these cases whether this was a question of like convenience or a God complex. But for people, and it may vary depending, but for people for whom this has happened, some of them define this as kind of medically induced rape because it's such a violation, right? And there are cases where this happens in a small community where you have multiple children who are all, genetically the children of a doctor who may be prominent in the community, and they don't know that they're related to each other. They don't know that they're related to their mom's doctor. There's one notable case where some of these children of a doctor actually confronted him in a restaurant, sat down with him for a meal. And he was, I think, kind of quoting Bible verse at them as if to suggest, I don't know, that, that he, his actions were justified, or perhaps that he was more righteous than them, or that he had given them life. I'm not quite sure. But he felt that what he had done was perfectly fine. And increasingly, you'll see state legislatures are saying that is not fine. There are also cases where people believe that they're getting sperm from a specific person or a specific type of person because you can kind of request. And, the record keeping isn't there, or there's outright mistakes or purposeful fraud. I don't know. But, somebody winds up getting something other than that. And there are also cases where people become friends with their half siblings without knowing that they're genetically half siblings. You have cases of, kids going through school together or going through college together, getting to be friends and not knowing that they are half siblings. And there's a great fear on the part of some donor conceived people that they could, if there's a lot of folks who are conceived through the same donor in a small city, they could date one another without knowing it. So, it's interesting that the DNA testing, which is one technology, has very much brought to light the practices of another industry or technology, which is the fertility industry and its shortcomings.
I can't remember the term for it, what you just mentioned. It was about how when you meet someone you didn't know you were previously related to, and then there can be a kind of like a sexual attraction even, and that it can be distressing, obviously, because you can't really, it doesn't fit with what you believe to be regular. But how do people deal with that psychologically?
Yeah, so that's something that hasn't been widely studied, but you hear about in some of these communities. So it's sort of more anecdotal. I haven't seen a lot in the way of like rigorous research on it. But it is called GSA, which stands for genetic sexual attraction. And you do hear anecdotally stories of people who, say fathers and daughters or half siblings meeting each other for the first time and experiencing it. It doesn't mean that they act on it. It doesn't constitute incest, but it can be like a very uncomfortable feeling. And that obviously, right? And so I can't tell you sort of exactly why it happens or how common it is, or, you know, like what the mechanism is, because it hasn't been really studied. But, you know, it's happening more and more that people are now discovering genetic kin like late in life. So I would imagine that there could be somebody who researches it in coming years.
One of the more interesting or most interesting passages for me, maybe everybody remembers the incident with the Golden State Killer and how the FBI was able to use the DNA test results to solve that crime pretty much. So is it fair for DNA test results that were obtained for family history purposes to be used for crime solving purposes?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that case, which was solved, well, they arrested the suspect. Back then he was a suspect, Joseph James D'Angelo, in April of 2018. He just pled guilty and was convicted this summer. So he pled guilty to 13 homicides, and he admitted to multiple rapes. I believe that he's considered responsible for over 50 rapes. So this was a guy who was terrorizing residents of California in the 70s and 80s, I think. And, you know, he was a serial killer, and, you know, it was a cold case forever and ever. And the man that they arrested and later convicted was someone who was never on their person of interest watch list. He was never a suspect. He was never somebody that they had on their list to look at, talking about police, law enforcement. So, you know, were it not for this, he would probably still be out there. And at the same time, as you can kind of applaud that and applaud the fact that a number of cold cases of alleged or convicted at this point murderers and rapists have been, you know, closed as a result of this. In the beginning, there was a great protest from privacy experts, some legal experts, some genetic genealogists, that this was not how the information was gathered. Like, the information wasn't gathered for this purpose. It was gathered for people to do family history research. People had taken their DNA, downloaded it from private companies' websites, uploaded it to GEDmatch, which is this kind of like open source Wikipedia of DNA, where anyone can upload their DNA and then compare with someone else's. So if you want to compare across databases and you can't, you can do it this way. You know, people had uploaded there for one reason, and it was being used for something else, and there were great concerns about consent. And now GEDmatch has a kind of a policy where you opt into this use. And now there's also another database that police are using, which is Family Tree DNA, which is the oldest. It's a private company, and they do testing themselves, but you can opt out of law enforcement searching in their database. So I think the concern about whether it's kind of consistent with the way people intended their DNA to be used is greatly lessened by the fact that now there's some controls around it, but there's still a lot of other concerns. Although I'll say the majority of the population, from what I've seen, seems to be in favor of this. Like, you don't see a hue and cry when you see like polls of Americans on this topic. They're like, to catch murderers, it's okay. But, you know, there are concerns about it, right? What are the controls? The fact that this is decisions by private kind of individuals who own companies to give law enforcement access to this information, that there's kind of no guardrails in place to ensure that the kinds of crimes that are being used. I mean, there's some policies, but I haven't seen much in the way of legislation to say, like, when can you use this and when can you not? And there's some legal experts who say that this is basically a violation of the Fourth Amendment. So, kind of like a fishing expedition that implicates people who would not be found any other way. And on and on and on, right? But yet it hasn't been challenged in the court, and I don't know what would happen if it were challenged. So it's a really thorny issue. When I was writing my book proposal, and I sold the book proposal in, I want to say, March or April of 2018, and this happened. And I was negotiating with my new editor, and I realized, okay, I've got to add a chapter. So I wound up writing a whole entire chapter on use of DNA to solve crimes. And it kept changing as I was writing the book, and I kept having to update it. And it was like the last chapter to be fully finished, but it's not, of course it's not finished, right? Because it's a complicated and ongoing story that we're all watching with interest, because it's absolutely fascinating, because it's really changed the way that police attack cold cases. They can solve these old crimes if they have the DNA that previously they simply couldn't.
I just remembered that I've been remiss and I haven't invited you guys to post your questions. So if anyone has any questions, please do comment them. And I'm sorry, I was being hasty.
That's
so talking about how so many Americans have tested already and their DNA can kind of overlap to people don't even have to test their own for their results to be out there. Where do you see industry leaders like Ancestry and 23andMe as the number of orders for home DNA tests slow down? Where do these industries go from here?
Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, there's been like a recent slowdown in the last maybe 9 months, I want to say. So you saw this like kind of slope going up when you looked at DNA test kit sales. And then recently it's kind of more like this. So it's a good question. And the theories about why that is are primarily that that they kind of vacuumed up all the early adopters who were interested in paying $99 or $69 to do family history research, right? And so that's probably a big part of it. There's also a contingent possibly that's concerned about privacy issues. And so both those factors may be responsible for the slowdown. And what you've seen recently is kind of a pivot on behalf of a lot of these companies. So previously, 23andMe was the only major company that offered testing for health-related issues, medical issues like might you be at risk of early onset Alzheimer's, or, we're going to tell you about your carrier status for a particular genetic disease, or even, are you more likely to have like wet or dry earwax, like traits testing. And so 23andMe was always like known for that. And the other companies were primarily like Ancestry and MyHeritage were primarily offering just the pie chart with their ethnicity and the list of relatives. And now both MyHeritage and Ancestry have come on to offering like the health related testing. And it may be that pivot, I would imagine, it seems, is connected to the slowdown, right? And that they're looking for ways to entice people into this product that may not be interested in doing it for family history research purposes. But what that means is that if they're successful, the databases are going to continue to go up, right? It's just that people will be finding different, maybe primarily be interested in different results. And what you're seeing potentially is more of a kind of a coming together between the medical industry and these private DNA testing companies. So for instance, like with Ancestry, they're using like Physicians Network to help facilitate the tests and, approve them. And there may be involvement from physicians or genetic counselors at some of these companies in giving you your results. So you're kind of seeing like, in some ways, maybe the medicalization of what was previously just the recreational industry. So that's kind of interesting. And I'll be watching to see where that goes.
Right. So I guess we are nearing the top of the hour. In closing, you probably know more about this than anyone I know. Do you have any advice for people who've been thinking about taking an at-home DNA test?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say as somebody who's done it and has had my set of experiences and also interviewed a lot of other people about their experiences, which have often been very different than mine, I will say it can be like a really joyous and wondrous experience because it gives you the kind of immediacy of the past, right? And you have access to information you previously never would. Like we found a second cousin on my dad's side, a Swedish cousin. We were able to go to Sweden and meet that cousin and learn all about my dad's grandmother's life because of that connection. Something that we would never otherwise have been able to do. And at the same time, I do understand why some people are hesitant, and they tend to be hesitant for two reasons. One is they're like, well, I don't know what kind of skeletons in the closet this test is going to pull up. And the other is, well, I don't know what they're going to do with that information, right? Like basic privacy concerns, but different kinds of privacy concerns. And to those people, I would say that sounds fine to me. If you're not inclined to take a test, don't, right? But to kind of also acknowledge that, your decision not to take a test doesn't necessarily inoculate you from finding out something in your family, right? That maybe you weren't expecting, maybe it doesn't comport with the narrative that you long believed, and what everyone's always told you. And so sort of the secondary advice I have is actually for the older generation who may have been in possession of a secret about the genetic identities of their children. Again, for very understandable reasons. And yet at this point, for better and for worse, depending on the situation, depending on the family, it's really no longer a choice to keep these secrets, right? Because maybe you happen to know that your daughter is donor conceived. You're in your 80s, your daughter's in her 60s. Maybe you happen to know that she's donor conceived. Of course, and you never told her. And maybe you're not concerned that she's going to test. Maybe she won't, but her daughter might test, right? Your granddaughter or somebody else connected to the family who the testing, could reveal this truth. And, from everyone I've interviewed, it turns out something that makes sense to us kind of intuitively, that it is much better to find out something from someone who loves you, even if it's very, very late in the game, even if you're well into middle age, it's much better to find out from someone who loves you than from a computer screen. So I would say to those people, consider the possibility that whatever the thing is that is a secret in your family may not be a secret forever, and consider the possibility you may need to have difficult conversations. And there are increasingly people out there who can help you with these difficult conversations. There's a wonderful genetic counselor named Brianne Kirkpatrick who runs a genetic counseling service called Watershed DNA. She actually holds people's hands virtually and helps them with these kinds of situations. And she's not the only one, but she's kind of a good place to start. And there are others. There are psychologists who are starting to specialize in this. So it's something we all need support for. We never expected it, right? Certainly the fertility banks never expected it when they were granting anonymity to sperm donors for decades. But it's where we are now. So it's certainly something to think about.
All right. Well, have a comment, but it doesn't look like we have any further questions. So Libby, thank you so much for your time. This has been fascinating. And do you want to let people know real quick where they can get a copy of your wonderful book?
Sure. Okay. Well, so I hear it's at the library. So that's one place. You can get it, of course, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, like the places where you probably buy a lot of books, if you're into buying books. But there's also, if you're interested in supporting independent bookstores during a pandemic, which is an important thing to do if you can, there's a website called bookshop.org. And that's a consortium of independent bookstores, and they can ship it to you. It's just like Amazon. It might be a few bucks more, but that's something to consider, bookshop.org. If you want a signed copy so you can have the experience of having been at a book signing, even though none of us can actually physically be together, unfortunately, there's a bookstore near my house. It's called the Village Bookstore. It's in Pleasantville, New York. And if you call the Village Bookstore in Pleasantville, New York, and ask them for a copy, I can actually go there. I can make it out to whoever you like. I can make it out to you or to someone else, and they will ship it to you anywhere in the country. So that's another good option.
Definitely support independent bookstores.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody who came. And I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Everybody have a great day.
Thank you so much.
End the live stream.
Yeah, thank you. All right. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.